folks, welcome back to the Edupedia world, and I am Abhinay Gupta. And now today we'll start with a fresh new topic, right? A topic which as a student scares us a bit, right? Yes, I'm talking about the tax audit, right? So when tax audit used to come to my mind, generally what I used to think is memorizing the sections, right? So yes, the topic for us today would be the audit under the fiscal law, right? Yes, specifically we are going to study about the form 3CD and all the various clauses, and we'll learn how to keep those clauses in mind as well, right? But before getting ahead to those clauses and the form and everything, let us understand the basics of the fiscal law, right? So what does this term fiscal stand for? So to understand this terminology, if you refer to the Google specifically, the definition that you get for fiscal is that it relates to anything which belongs to the government expenditure or revenue, right? Or in short, the government taxation. And hence any law governing that is termed as fiscal law, right? So fiscal means anything relating to the government expenditure and revenue, right? So when we talk about the government expenditure and revenue, right, and the law relating to it, we directly or indirectly refer to the taxes, either the direct taxes or the indirect taxes, because taxes are basically the revenue for the government, right? So we understand literally what fiscal law means, right? But what is the purpose for the existence of fiscal law is the second question that we need to cater to, right? So what do you think is the requirement of fiscal law in our country? So see, if I give you a brief understanding about the thing, right? So what happens is that we as an SSE maintain our accounts, right? And at the end we file our return, maybe our income tax return, the VAT return and stuff, right? Belonging to both the direct taxes as well as the indirect taxes section. And we submit or file those returns with the government, right? So what does the government basically do? They pick up on choice individual files and they check to ensure that the individual, right, has complied with the provisions issued by the Act. Specifically, we would talk about the Income Tax Act, right? Obviously, for indirect taxes, we would also go to the VAT Act and etc. But specifically, if we refer to Act over here, we will refer to the Income Tax Act, right? So the government needs to ensure that the individuals are preparing their accounts and submitting, because in India they assess their taxes themselves, right, initially, and then they submit it to the government to check. So the government cannot check all of them, right? So just to ensure the control over each of them, they say that okay, beyond a certain limit, that means if you are a large SSE, if there is a large revenue involved, let us do one thing, let us get you audited, right? So when the auditors, they get into the tax audit, they review the documents, they review the accounts, they review the assessments that you have made, right? And accordingly, because why do auditors do it or accountants do it? Is because they know the law, right? Not every SSE who is into business or into any profession would necessarily know the law. So the government, in order to ensure that yes, they are complying by it, right? So the fiscal law has been provided to them. They ensure that the SSEs are abiding by the fiscal law, and hence they are into the audit, right? So this is how it goes. So that is the reason why audit under the fiscal law is important, because now when the government goes on the test check basis, the risk of anything getting wrong minimizes to a great extent, right? So now we will commence with the chapter and understand, right, what do we do as an auditor in the department of tax audit, right? People who are into their internship, they understand that yeah, some of us are statutory auditors for our training, the others are tax auditors, and they are into various departments as well, right? So statutory auditors, they never understood what tax auditors do, right? So let us understand the role of tax auditors specifically in this chapter, right? And we will get into the detail of form 3CD, 3CB and stuff, and we will understand the entire assessment, right? So if we get into the understanding of the audit under fiscal law, the first thing that we need to see is that yes, the CBDT, Central Board of Direct Taxation, right? This board has levied the responsibility of the tax audit on the auditors, right? And this has been done via the Income Tax Act 1961. So the Income Tax Act 1961 lays down the various provisions relating to the audit under the fiscal law, right? So it is not only the CBDT, that is the direct tax, even in the case of indirect taxation, right? The state legislatures have come up with various provisions that require the compulsion of audit, right? Like to relate to it, you could see the inclusion of the audit provision in the legislation of the value added tax. That is how we come to know that yes, even the states are going ahead to promote the concept of compulsory audit into the matter of state, that is the indirect taxation specifically, right? So for that, we would see who are these auditors, who are the people who have been given the right to audit under the fiscal law, right? But before again going to it, I hope you people are very much clear with what is direct tax and what is indirect tax, right? I would assume that yes, we have mixture of the students from all backgrounds. So there may be students who have been referring to Group 1 now and did not even start with Group 2, right? So in the CA Final Group 2, you have the topic of direct tax and indirect taxation. So for some of you who may not be knowing the major difference between the two, let me elaborate the thing in brief for you, right? So when we talk about direct taxation, then it is that form of taxation where the liability to pay, that means the obligation to pay the tax, and the burden to pay the tax both falls on the same person. Whereas in the indirect tax, the liability to pay and the burden to pay falls on different people. How? Right? Because direct tax is basically the tax on your income. So when you earn, you pay your tax. So you are liable to pay the tax on your earning, and you are the person who actually bears the burden of that tax. But in the case of an indirect tax, right? Like for example, value added tax. So when you pass on the good from one point to the other, right? You pay VAT on that. So the VAT is something that you pay to the government, but the burden of that value added tax finally goes on the final consumer. So the burden falls on the other person, whereas the liability to pay that tax to the government falls on the other person. That is why it is not a direct tax on the consumer, but an indirect tax on the consumer. Why? Because the burden of that tax falls on the consumer, although it is paid by the middleman, right? And on the other hand, if you again compare, then direct taxes, they are levied on individual people, individual person, right? Whereas indirect tax is generally levied on the goods and services. Yes, the burden definitely goes on the final consumer, but the tax is levied on the basis of the goods that is sold. So every good, you have a tax added to it. Whereas in direct tax, every person on a cumulative will have his annual tax on it, right? So if we say the direct tax is a progressive tax, whereas indirect tax is a regressive tax, right? So this is the major understanding that you need to have when we talk about the direct tax and the indirect tax. Clear with it? Right? So when we talk about the CBDT giving the responsibility on the auditors via Income Tax Act, then we are specifically talking about the direct tax portion, about the earnings, right? We are not talking about the tax that is levied on the goods and services. Clear with that front? So let us understand who can do the tax audit or who can perform the audit under the fiscal law, right? So the audit is to be conducted by an accountant. So the Income Tax Act says that the audit will be conducted by an accountant. But again, Section 288, subsection 2 of the Income Tax Act says that the accountant should fall under the definition of accountant as a chartered accountant, given in the section which pertains to the CA Act 1949. Right? So the Income Tax Act says it has to be an accountant, but Section 288 specifies that that accountant has to be a chartered accountant as per the CA Act. Right? So now we also need to see in detail, can all chartered accountants go ahead with such an audit? Yeah, but one more thing. This is as per the Income Tax Act. But if you refer to the Companies Act, right, even they have the similar provision. Because they say it can be any auditor, any accountant, which is a chartered accountant as per the CA Act, or any other person who is entitled to be appointed as an auditor of the company under Section 226, subsection 2. So both the provisions are open. It is not only about a chartered accountant. It is also about any person who would be allowed to audit right, under the Companies Act 1956. So when I refer to the section 2 to 6, the section 2, I am referring to the Companies Act 1956 and not the Companies Act 2013. Because if you had to refer to the same section in the new Companies Act, then we would be referring it to section 141 of the Companies Act 2013, right, which is applicable only after 1/4/2014. But now there's a little bit of understanding that would go into it, right? When I talk about understanding, we need to actually understand, can all chartered accountants perform this audit, right? Because as per the definition of accountant, it is clear that any chartered accountant, whether he's in practice or he's not in practice, he would be termed as an accountant, right? But the confusion is cleared by section 7 of the Companies Act, which specifies that the non-practicing chartered accountant cannot go ahead with the tax audit, because it specifies that the accountant or the chartered accountant over there is required to also hold a certificate of practice, right? And hence he has to be a member. So not every person who has qualified the degree of chartered accountancy can do this audit. They have to have the degree of practice, which is the COP, Certificate of Practice. And to even give a detailed light upon this topic, there was a resolution passed by the Council on 1st April 2005 that a member in part-time practice is not entitled to perform any attest function. When I talk about part-time practice, means a member who holds a certificate of practice, who is involved in any practice, plus he is involved in any other business as well. So those members are said to be in part-time practice, right? So the council guidelines, right, the regulations, they say that any person who is into part-time practice is not allowed or is not entitled to perform the attest function, and that would also include the tax audit, right? So any non-practicing chartered accountant or any part-time chartered accountant cannot perform the tax audit. That is the crux, right? So although the definition under section 288 is not very clear on this front, right, but the overall understanding would give you the logic that the chartered accountant should hold a certificate of practice and should not be a part-time practitioner. Clear? So this is the person who can conduct the audit under the fiscal law, right? So far we have understood that it is the requirement of the government. Why does the government require us to get into the audit of these people, right? What are the acts involved into it, and who is exactly the person who would go ahead with such an audit, right? So if these basic understandings are clear, we would move ahead to the other understanding of the chapter, where we would take into consideration the public trust and the various businesses, the various professions, the limits, the liabilities, and all those things to understand in detail about the fiscal law, right? But now I want you all to get a clear understanding on what we have discussed so far. Topics that are to come forward, right? We would cover them up in the next lecture, right? So there we will go ahead with specific topics. So until then, this is Abhinav Gupta signing off. Thank you and bye-bye.